My daughter-in-law called me from my own driveway, her voice carrying that particular sweetness she only used when she thought she had won something. "I just wanted to let you know," she said, "that the movers finished this morning. Your workshop is completely cleared out. Every last thing." I stood there in the middle of a Home Depot parking lot in Columbus, holding a bag of fertilizer I'd never get to use, and I started to laugh. Not a polite chuckle. A real laugh. The kind that comes up from somewhere deep in your chest. She went quiet on the other end, confused, maybe a little unsettled. She had no idea what she had actually done, and that made me laugh even harder. My name is Walter, and at 63 years old, I thought I had already survived the hardest things life could throw at a man. I buried my wife Eleanor 4 years ago, after 38 years of marriage. I watched my son grow up, make choices I didn't always understand, and love him anyway because that's what fathers do. I built a small carpentry business from nothing, worked it for 30 years with my own 2 hands, and sold it when my knees started telling me it was time. I thought the hard part was behind me. I was wrong. My son Michael married his wife Renee 6 years ago. She was polished in the way that certain people are polished, the kind that comes from a lifetime of carefully managing impressions. Beautiful, well-spoken, always the first to compliment your haircut or your cooking, and somehow the compliments always made you feel slightly smaller instead of larger, though you couldn't quite say why. Eleanor had seen it immediately. She pulled me aside after their second visit and said, very quietly, "That woman counts everything, Walter." I told her she was being uncharitable. I wish I had listened. The trouble started about 2 years after Eleanor passed. Michael called me one Sunday evening, which was unusual because Michael and I had a standing arrangement to talk on Thursday afternoons. Sunday calls meant something was happening. "Dad, Renee and I have been talking," he said, and I could hear the careful flatness in his voice that told me he had rehearsed this. "We think it might be time to talk about your living situation." I was 61 years old, in good health, living in the house where Michael had grown up, a 3-bedroom colonial on Ash Grove Lane that Eleanor and I had paid off in full 15 years earlier. My living situation, as far as I was concerned, was perfectly fine. "My living situation is a house I own," I said. "We know that, Dad, but it's a lot of space for one person. The upkeep, the yard, the property taxes. We've been looking at some really nice senior communities outside of Columbus. Independent living, but with support available if you ever need it." I set down the book I had been reading. "Michael, I'm 61. I know, but the good ones have waiting lists. You'd want to get on the list now." A pause, and then Renee's voice in the background, the particular murmur of someone coaching from just off stage. "Also, if you sold the house while the market is strong, you'd have significant liquidity. You could invest it, travel, do the things you always said you wanted to do. Travel." I had never once told Michael or Renee that I wanted to travel. Eleanor had wanted to travel. After she passed, the thought of visiting the places we had planned together felt like pressing on a bruise. I told Michael I would think about it. I did not think about it. But Renee was patient. That was the thing about her. She had a patience that felt less like virtue and more like strategy. Over the following months, the subject came up in different forms. The house needed a new roof. Wasn't that a burden? The neighborhood had changed. Didn't I feel isolated out there? My workshop in the backyard took up half the yard. Wouldn't I like more green space to enjoy? Always framed as concern, always wrapped in that careful sweetness, always landing just slightly wrong in a way I couldn't immediately explain. The workshop was the real issue, and it took me a while to understand that. Eleanor and I had built it together 20 years ago, when the carpentry business started doing well enough that I could afford to invest in a proper space. It wasn't large, maybe 400 square feet, but it was insulated, climate-controlled, with good lighting and storage built into every wall. After I sold the business, it became my refuge. I spent mornings out there working on pieces for people I liked, neighbors and friends who needed a cabinet restored or a table built. I wasn't charging much. It wasn't about money. It was about having something to do with my hands and a reason to get up in the morning, which matters more than people realize when you're a widower living alone. Renee began commenting on the workshop within a year of Eleanor's death. It was an eyesore, she thought, though she never said it quite that directly. It was taking up valuable square footage of the property. It was probably not up to current code. It was the kind of thing that makes buyers nervous. That last one caught my attention because I hadn't mentioned selling anything. Michael and Renee lived 40 minutes away in a newer house in a newer neighborhood. The kind of development where every house looks like every other house, and the homeowners association sends letters if your mailbox is the wrong shade of beige. I knew Renee liked that house. I also knew she liked the idea of a larger house, a better neighborhood, a kitchen renovation, a master bath that matched something she had seen in a magazine. I had overheard enough conversations to understand that Michael's income as a civil engineer, while solid, did not fully fund the life Renee had envisioned for herself. My house on Ashgrove Lane was paid off and worth, by my most recent estimate, somewhere around $340,000. The workshop added another $40,000 in assessed value. Eleanor's life insurance, combined with the proceeds from selling the carpentry business, sat in accounts that Renee probably suspected existed but did not know the details of. That was by design. 3 years after Eleanor died, I made a quiet decision. I called my old friend and attorney, a man named Gerald, who had handled my business contracts for decades and whose judgment I trusted completely. I told him what I had been observing: the pressure to sell the house, the comments about the workshop, the senior community brochures that appeared in my mailbox without my having requested them, the way Renee steered conversations toward my finances with a consistency that felt less like curiosity and more like research. Gerald listened carefully. Then he asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Walter, what's actually in that workshop?" I told him the tools, the equipment, the lumber stock, a lifetime of accumulated things that serious woodworkers accumulate. Gerald was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking what's in there now. I'm asking if you've ever had it properly appraised, the structure itself and everything inside it." I hadn't, not formally. "Have someone do that," Gerald said. "And in the meantime, let's talk about some protective measures for your estate." What Gerald helped me understand over the following weeks changed the way I saw my own situation entirely. 30 years of running a carpentry business had left me with more than just savings and a paid-off house. I had, over the years, developed and patented 2 tool modifications, simple improvements to joinery equipment that I had designed out of frustration with the standard versions. I had licensed those patents to a tool manufacturer and collected quarterly royalties that arrived quietly and consistently into an account I rarely thought about. The patents had 6 years left before expiration. At current royalty rates, that was approximately $280,000 in future income that existed entirely outside the assets most people associated with my name. I had also, on Gerald's advice 20 years earlier, placed my most valuable woodworking equipment into an LLC. The stated reason at the time was liability protection. The practical effect now was that the most significant assets in my workshop, a collection of vintage and semi-vintage machinery that had appreciated considerably, were technically owned by an entity that Renee had never asked about and almost certainly didn't know existed. Gerald walked me through what this meant in real terms. If Michael and I ever had a legal dispute about the estate, or if a divorce ever became part of the picture, these assets were structured in a way that protected them. They were not hidden. They were properly documented, properly reported, properly everything. They were just organized in a way that only became visible if you asked the right questions. And Renee, like most people who assumed they already knew the answers, had never asked the right questions. The appraiser Gerald sent came on a Tuesday morning when I knew Michael and Renee would both be at work. He spent 4 hours in the workshop, moving slowly and quietly, photographing everything, taking measurements, consulting references on his tablet. When he was finished, he sat with me at my kitchen table and showed me his preliminary figures. The vintage equipment alone, a collection I had assembled over 30 years of haunting estate sales and equipment auctions, was worth just over $180,000. Some of the pieces were rare. One, an 1890s hand-operated mortising machine that I had restored over the course of 2 winters, had been inquired about by a museum in Vermont. I had declined to sell it because Eleanor had loved watching me work on it. She called it the Monster and brought me coffee while I cleaned its mechanisms on cold Saturday mornings. When I saw the full appraisal, I sat very still for a long time. Then I called Gerald and told him I needed to update some documents. The months after that conversation were interesting. I went on with my life as I always had. I worked in the workshop most mornings. I had dinner with Michael and Renee every few weeks, watching Renee watch me, watching her calculate, watching her patience wear slowly thinner as I continued to simply live my life without selling anything or moving anywhere. In February, she suggested again that we tour a senior community. I said I'd consider it. In April, she mentioned a real estate agent she knew who was doing great things in my neighborhood. I thanked her for the information. In June, she brought Michael to dinner at my house and spent most of the evening making observations about how the kitchen could use updating, and how the workshop must be so hard to heat in winter. I told her the insulation I had installed made it quite comfortable. She smiled in that way she had and said nothing more, but I saw the calculations continuing behind her eyes. I had been planning for what came next, though I didn't know exactly when it would come. I had taken steps I told no one about. I had the most irreplaceable items in the workshop documented in meticulous detail and photographed from every angle. I had updated my will with Gerald's help, and the updated version contained specifics that would have surprised everyone who thought they knew what I owned. I had also, 6 months before that February conversation, arranged with a trusted former employee of mine, a young man named Pete who had worked for me for 12 years and had the skills and the storage space to handle the task, to move the most valuable equipment out of the workshop during a week when I told Michael and Renee I would be visiting my brother in Knoxville. The workshop looked exactly the same from the outside. The shelves were still full. The workbenches still held projects. There were still tools hanging on the pegboard walls. But the equipment that actually mattered, the pieces the appraiser had valued, sat safely in Pete's temperature-controlled storage facility in a warehouse district 30 minutes east of my house, documented as the property of my LLC. I had also made quiet inquiries about the Vermont Museum. They were still interested in the mortising machine. We had reached a preliminary agreement pending final condition review, at a price that I will simply say was considerably more than I had expected. Eleanor would have found the whole thing both completely unsurprising and deeply entertaining. The call from Renee came on a Thursday morning in October, while I was indeed at Home Depot, doing something as ordinary as buying fertilizer for the beds Eleanor had planted along the back fence. I was going to divide the hostas that weekend and plant them along the other side of the yard. Small tasks, the kind that keep a life feeling like a life. My phone rang and I saw Renee's name and answered it, expecting something routine. Walter, hi. I just wanted to let you know the movers finished this morning. Your workshop is completely cleared out. Every last thing. The world went very quiet around me. I could hear the sounds of the store, the beep of registers, someone asking a question about mulch in the next aisle. I'm sorry, I said, though I had heard her perfectly. Michael and I talked about it, and we decided this was the best thing. The workshop was bringing down the value of the property, and you weren't using it the way you used to. We found a company that clears these things out, donates what can be donated, disposes of what can't. It's already done. Now you can think seriously about listing the house. There was that sweetness in her voice, the warmth of someone who has decided they are helping you. I thought about the workshop in that moment, the tools on the pegboard, the project on the workbench, a small cabinet I had been building for my neighbor's granddaughter, who was going to college in the spring and wanted something for her dorm room. I thought about the most valuable equipment, sitting safe and documented in Pete's storage, exactly where I had put it, and I started to laugh. Walter, what's funny? What are you laughing at? Nothing, I said, which was not entirely honest. I'll call you later. I drove home slowly, watching the October light come through the trees on Ashgrove Lane, those same trees that had been saplings when Michael was in grade school and were now so large their branches touched across the road. I parked in the driveway and walked around the side of the house to the workshop. The door was standing open. They had left it open. I walked in and stood in the middle of it and looked around at what remained. The pegboard with its hooks, now mostly empty. The workbench, cleared. The shelves, stripped. The cabinet for my neighbor's granddaughter, gone. The small things, the ordinary things, the things that had no value to anyone but me. I stood there for a while. Then I called Gerald. He answered on the second ring. They cleared out the workshop, I told him. Hows? When? This morning, apparently, while I was at Home Depot. Another pause, longer this time. Did they take the equipment, the registered pieces? No, I said. Those have been in Pete's facility for 6 months. I heard Gerald exhale. Okay, here's what you're going to do. Don't call Michael yet. Don't call Renee. Call me back in an hour after I've spoken to someone in the property crimes unit I know. What they did this morning is not a gray area, Walter. I sat down on the workbench stool, the one I had turned on my own lathe the first winter after I built the workshop. It was still there. They hadn't taken it, probably because it looked like a stool and not like something valuable. I ran my hand over the worn wood of the seat. Then I called Pete to make sure everything was still secure in storage. It was. I drove to Michael and Renee's house that evening. I had called ahead and told Michael I needed to talk to them both, that it was important. He sounded careful on the phone, which told me Renee had already spoken to him and they had agreed on what to say. They were both in the living room when I arrived, sitting together on their cream-colored sofa in a posture that suggested they had prepared. Renee had made tea. There was tea on the coffee table when I came in. She had made tea. "Dad, we know this might have been a surprise," Michael began before I had even fully sat down. "But Renee and I felt it was time to stop enabling the avoidance. You haven't moved forward since Mom died, and holding on to that workshop was part of the problem." I looked at my son. He was 40 years old, with his mother's eyes and my stubbornness and an expression on his face that I recognized as borrowed, the particular careful reasonableness that Renee used when she had written the script and he was performing it. "Renee," I said, "tell me exactly what was removed." She set down her tea. "Everything that was in there. The tools, the materials, some old equipment. The company donated usable items to 2 vocational schools and a Habitat for Humanity restore. The rest was disposed of." "Did you go through the workshop yourself before the movers came?" She hesitated. "I walked through it, yes, to make sure everything was handled appropriately." "Did you see the serial numbers on the machinery?" Something shifted in her expression. "There wasn't any valuable machinery, Walter. It was tools. Old tools. There were 6 pieces of registered equipment in that workshop, each one documented with serial numbers in a business inventory I've maintained for 30 years. Each one owned not by me personally, but by my LLC, Ashgrove Woodcraft." Renee's eyes went still. "The equipment with the highest value," I continued, "was a collection of vintage American and European machinery assembled over 30 years. The appraised value, as of 8 months ago, is $182,000. Michael made a sound. Not words, just a sound. "That equipment has been in secure storage since April," I said. "So whatever was removed this morning, it wasn't that." Renee set down her tea very carefully. "You moved it? Before we—" She stopped. "Before you cleared out my workshop without telling me?" "Yes. We're your family," she said, and her voice had shifted to something harder underneath the surface. "We have your best interests." "You have your interests," I said. "I've been watching you calculate them for 6 years." Michael was looking at his wife with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Unsettled, maybe. The expression of someone who has been handed a piece of information and is reorganizing what they thought they knew around it. "Dad," he said, "I didn't know about any equipment or an LLC." "I know you didn't," I said, and I felt something genuinely painful in that moment, because I believed him. Michael had followed along, as people do with a persuasive partner, without asking the questions that would have told him what he was following along into. I pulled out the folder Gerald had helped me prepare and set it on the coffee table next to the tea. Inside were the LLC documentation, the equipment appraisal, the inventory records, and a letter from Gerald outlining the legal situation created by the morning's events. The company Renee hired removed items from my property without my authorization. Some of those items, the ones actually present this morning, were my personal property and are gone. Others, the LLC's registered equipment, were not there. But the action itself, entering my property and removing items I own while I was absent, without my knowledge or consent, is criminal in Ohio. "We're your family," Renee said again, and now the sweetness was gone entirely. What was underneath it was not pretty. "You can't be serious about involving the law in a family matter." "I am completely serious." "You would do that to your own son?" "What I would do," I said, "is make sure my son understands exactly what was done this morning and by whom and why. He can make his own choices from there." I looked at Michael when I said that. He was looking at the folder on the table with the expression of a man who is starting to understand that the map he has been using does not match the territory. The weeks that followed were the hardest of the process, not because of the legal complications, but because of Michael. Gerald's contact at the Property Crimes Unit was helpful. The company Renee had hired operated legally, following what they had been told, that she was the authorized party instructing the removal. Renee was the one who had misrepresented her authority. Gerald sent a formal letter outlining our legal position. The company cooperated fully, providing documentation of exactly what had been removed and where it had gone. The vocational schools still had most of the personal tools and materials. Habitat for Humanity had some lumber and hardware. A smaller amount had been disposed of. Gerald filed the paperwork for full restitution. But Michael had questions. He came alone on a Saturday morning, without calling ahead, which told me he had things to say that he didn't want Renee to know he was saying. I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table where he had done homework as a child, and I had paid bills, and Eleanor had read on Sunday mornings. "How long have you known?" he asked. "That Renee was maneuvering toward the house and the estate?" "A few years." "Seriously planning for it?" "About 18 months. Michael was quiet for a while, turning his coffee cup on the table. "I believed her," he said finally. When she talked about the workshop, about the senior communities, she said you were struggling and not willing to admit it. She said you needed someone to push you forward. Did I seem like I was struggling to you? A long pause. I wanted to believe it, he said. It was easier than believing the alternative. I understood that. I didn't say anything. Sometimes the most useful thing a father can do is give a silence in which something true can be said. She knew about the life insurance. Michael continued. From Mom. She asked me about it early on, how much, how it was structured. I thought it was normal. Planning. Being responsible. Did it seem normal? He looked up. It seemed like Renee. I reached across the table and put my hand briefly on his. He was 40 years old, my son, with his mother's eyes and the look of someone navigating a grief they hadn't anticipated. The grief of understanding someone you love in a way you didn't want to. What happens now? He asked. That's up to you, I said. Between you and Renee. Between us. Those are different questions. Michael and Renee separated 3 months later. I did not cause that, and I want to be clear about it. Marriages separate for the reasons they separate, and whatever truth Michael was sitting with after that Saturday morning was his to reckon with. I only know that he started calling on Thursdays again, and then he started stopping by on Saturdays, sitting at the kitchen table, helping me with the yard, asking me, once, if he could come out and see the workshop space, which was still empty, and I said yes, and we stood in it together for a while without saying much. You're going to rebuild it? He asked. I'm going to put back what matters, I said. Pete and I spent the following spring moving the equipment back from storage. Not everything. The mortising machine had gone to the Vermont Museum, a transaction that I thought Eleanor would have laughed about for weeks. But most of it came back. The vintage planer, the old drill press with the cracked paint on the housing that I had never gotten around to repainting and now never would. The cabinet for my neighbor's granddaughter had been among the items donated to a vocational school, and when I called the school to explain the situation, the instructor who answered told me the students had finished it and it was a beautiful piece. He sent me a photograph. I printed it out and put it on the refrigerator. I am 63 years old, and my workshop is running again. Michael comes over on Saturdays. He does not know much about woodworking, but he is learning, slowly, asking questions in the careful way of someone who is trying to pay attention. I am teaching him the way my father taught me, without pressure, without performance, just side by side with the work in front of us. Gerald tells me the restitution case resolved as these things tend to resolve, with financial accountability and a legal record that goes nowhere near criminal charges, because I declined to push it that far. I had thought about pushing it. There were days when what Renee had done to that workshop, the casual decisiveness of it, the certainty that she had the right, made something genuinely angry move through me. But anger is expensive to maintain, and I have better things to spend my energy on. I have a waiting list for my furniture now. Word gets around in the way it does in older neighborhoods where people still talk to each other across fences and at the hardware store. A retired teacher in the next block wants a rocking chair. A young couple 2 streets over is expecting their first child and wants a crib built the way cribs used to be built, with solid wood and joinery you can trust. A woman I met at the senior center, a sharp-eyed widow named Carol who reminds me just enough of Eleanor to be interesting and not enough to be painful, wants a bookshelf. She came by to look at the workshop and asked very specific questions about wood selection that told me she knew more than most people about furniture. I found that appealing in a way I had not expected to find anything appealing. I have not made any decisions about that. I am in no hurry. The lesson of the last few years, if I have understood it correctly, is that the things worth keeping are worth being careful with. Patience is not passivity. It is the practice of knowing which things deserve your full attention and giving them that, without rushing toward conclusions, you are not ready for. The house on Ashgrove Lane is staying. The workshop is running. Michael is here on Saturdays. Eleanor's hostas came up this spring, strong and green along the back fence, exactly where she planted them. I divided them the way I planned to the morning of Renee's phone call, and now there are 2 rows of them, one along each side of the yard, opening the space and making the whole garden feel larger and more full of life. I stood out there one evening last month, the light coming low through the trees, and I thought about that phone call in the Home Depot parking lot, the laughter that came up out of nowhere, the particular feeling of standing in a moment that someone else thought was your defeat and understanding, quietly and completely, that it was not. My father used to say that the best work is built to last. He was talking about furniture. He was also talking about everything else. I think about that a lot. Out in the workshop in the mornings, with the light coming through the window, Eleanor helped me choose the placement for, and the sound of the tools I have used long enough that they feel like extensions of my hands, and the knowledge that what I have built here, in this house, in this yard, in the life I am still in the process of living, is not going anywhere. Not unless I decide to move it myself. The most valuable things we own are rarely the ones that show up in an appraisal. Walter's real inheritance wasn't the machinery or the patents or even the house on Ashgrove Lane. It was the quiet wisdom to protect what mattered, the patience to let truth reveal itself, and the grace to rebuild a relationship with his son without bitterness. What endures isn't what we accumulate, but what we choose to pass on. A small note to our listeners. This story was created and imagined by AI, crafted to bring you an entertaining listen and, hopefully, a small reminder that integrity and patience are always worth building your life around.